What's up everyone, how are you all? Today we are back with another blazing Dragon Ball story. What if Dragon has the wolf summoning contract? If you enjoy then please like, share and do comments. Gohan's body and mind were slowly coming around. The emergency care protocol of his ship must have put some of his body's functions into almost complete shutdown or extreme slowdown to stabilize him after he'd set the instructions for the nearest safe haven the ship could locate. That some of his senses were back online but that he couldn't move or talk were telltale signs of the emergency care that had kept him alive and got him to at least a partial recovery. A small hand pressed itself flat against his chest. Something about the touch was caring, but he couldn't understand affection or care wasn't really something he was used to. His heartbeat was irregular. Whether that was due the recovery from the slowdown, or the relief that he was still alive, or from that gentle touch, he didn't know. Was someone trying to help him? If he was back on a Saiyan-controlled planet he'd have been unceremoniously thrown into a recovery tank by this point. Sympathy or care would be hard to come by. And if it had been the enemy he'd be in a significantly worse position. Whoever you are, despite whatever mess you're involved in, I hope you're still alive, an anxious female voice said. Please don't be dead, followed it up. The sound of her voice was so close to him, she was right in front of him but he couldn't open his eyes or move his body. He tried to breathe in through his nose to pick up any sense he recognized. If he could he might be able to place where he was but his body and muscles wouldn't do what he told them. Hard plastic covered his mouth and nose anyway. The ship's breathing mask was still over his face, blocking his mouth and nose from the outside air. The hand moved from his chest. Even such a small, compassionate and caring act had been so alien to him, and the loss of the touch left a hole somewhere within him briefly. When was the last time he'd been taken care of, or even needed taking care of? Alarm bells started ringing in his head. He was too distracted and not in control of this situation or even his own defense. He didn't know where he was or who the person or people around him were, whether they had good intentions towards him or ill. He had to remember to always be prepared to fight and kill if the situation demanded it. That was his only purpose. Movements in air currents around him, the shuffle of clothing, and his key sensing abilities told him that the person in front of him had moved her hand away from his chest towards his wrist, and his defensive instincts kicked in. His tail was the only part of his body that responded and he wrapped it firmly around her forearm as it reached towards his own. He readied himself in case he'd need to defend himself or attack immediately. Without knowing where he was, this could already be a situation which could have terrible consequences. He couldn't sense any threats around, at least when he reached out with his key, but that didn't mean there weren't any. Gohan steeled himself, ready for whatever he might have to do. His eyes finally followed his commands to open. The light was blinding for a second. There was no way to know right now how long it had even been since they'd last opened. As they were adjusting to the brightness, a pair of light blue eyes set in the pale face of a girl or young woman met his own gaze, her dark hair pulled into two bunches framing her face. They stared eye to eye for a few more seconds before the terrified look in the girl's eyes shamed him. His readiness for murder and destruction dissipated immediately. His hold on her forearm with his tail relaxed slightly, but kept a loose grip on her with it, the tail loosely looped around her lean arm. Not dead yet, he ground out after a few moments, as much to himself as her, but still eye to eye with the girl. He sounded more gravelly than he was expecting. A scream came from a little further away. Another girl, this one light-haired, stared at him open-mouthed, somehow even more terrified than the first one had been. The dark-haired one moved protectively in front of the other. Gohan's lips twitched into the slightest of smiles at her bravery. Behind them a larger key signal approached quickly, taking Gohan's focus away from them. From high up in the sky a short man descended quickly, landing on the beach, skillfully transitioning from flight into a run towards him. "Hey, you two, get away from him!" the man cried out to the girls. Not bad advice, thought Gohan as he reached up to disengage the breathing mask. Once it was loose, the hard plastic no longer pressed into his skin, and the feel of fresh air against his face was welcome. Glancing quickly at the live star chart of his ship beside him, he could see he was on an unrecognized planet in an unmapped area of space. Despite the pain in his arms, he took hold of the frame of his ship with his hands and dragged himself out onto his feet, and shuffled towards the others a few steps. He stopped and pulled himself to his full height despite his body still aching with stiffness and soreness. Behind him his tail swished and flexed, now completely free. He studied the three gathered in front of him. They were uncannily similar to Saiyans, of comparable coloring and features, although the blonde girl's hair color would never be seen on a Saiyan, nor would the bright colored eyes of both girls. Their softer facial features also lacked the harshness of Saiyans, and the wilder hair that was typical of them. No tails were visible. Man also had no apparent nose, but from such a sample size he couldn't assume that all the males of this planet shared this attribute. Gohan himself had at least one non-standard characteristic among Saiyans himself. A lot of races in the galaxy weren't so different though. 2 arms and 2 legs was the most common, and even 10 digits on hands was seen more often than not, so this wasn't all that Tuffles they shared planet Vegeta with weren't so different either, noticeably smaller than Saiyans and with pure white or very pale skin. He looked back between the 3 of them. The man had some fighting and key manipulation prowess and appeared to understand the danger Gohan himself posed, or at least could pose. However, Gohan wasn't concerned his strength was a threat, although he definitely needed to keep an eye on him. His eyes made contact with the 2 girls in turn. The dark-haired one who had been trying to help him now looking ready to fight and defend her friend, who was still frozen to the same spot. Despite that one's willingness to fight, neither of them could harm him, but he'd not got this far in this kind of life by underestimating others. The blonde girl's eyes didn't move when he made eye contact with her, still staring at him in fright. He held eye contact for a few moments, but then had to look away. He couldn't stand looking at it, that innocence in her eyes. Instead he scanned his eyes across the beach and the blue sky above. Wherever he was, the scenery was beautiful. A perfect yellow sand beach stretched around the coast. Flocks of small white birds were circling overhead as they cawed loudly, others strutting along the sand close to the water. After watching the birds for a few moments, he turned his focus back to the 3 individuals. A quiet and fragile tension descended on them all as the 2 sides weighed each other up. The silence hung in the air around them. Gohan decided to break the stalemate. "I'm not going to hurt anyone," he said, trying to reassure. He offered an olive branch right away, they might take it. He just hoped it sounded as genuine as it was. "Yeah right," the man answered caustically. "As if we'd trust a Saiyan." Gohan masked the surprise in his face. "You've encountered Saiyans before?" The man nodded in response. "How many have you met?" "Only a few, but more than enough for a lifetime," he bit back. "They were here." The man nodded again. Very strange, thought Gohan. If Saiyans had been here, why was it an uncharted planet in the galaxy map of his ship? "What do you know of Frieza or his empire?" He asked Gohan, focused on the shorter man. While he was concealing his full ki, Gohan's ki sensing abilities were excellent, and even if he could only estimate the true level of power, he felt confident that neither he nor the 2 girls were a danger to him, but kept on his guard. "Never heard of it," came the answer from the man. The blank faces of the girls suggested they'd truly never heard of it, but the man's answer was a little too forced. Gohan swept his eyes back to the man. He was sure he'd seen a flicker of recognition in the dark-haired man's eyes when he'd mentioned Frieza. Somehow he was sure that this man knew at least something, but whatever it was wasn't common knowledge on this planet. Whatever the case was, it did seem that this was a planet blissfully untroubled by the enormous war raging across the stars, at least for now. "I'm not interested in this planet. I don't even know where I am," and it's best that you tell me as little about it as possible," he added. The less he knew about this place the less at risk it would be. "I can't trust anything you say," the man retorted. Gohan gave up conversing with the understandably stubborn man for now and looked down at his own hands and body. He was caked in dust from that godforsaken moon he'd been on, mixed with at least as much blood and ash from the battle. No wonder he looked so terrifying to them. Although even if he was perfectly clean they'd still be spooked, especially the man who'd dealt with Saiyans before. He couldn't help but think back to the battle that put him in this position, clenching his fists, nails digging into his skin. He felt a hollowness in his chest. The closest thing he had to a friend was dead. It was pointless to linger on that right now. Saiyans died in battle all the time. He breathed in and out deeply in order to refocus his mind and decide what to do next. His torn battle armor was distractingly constricting against his body, and the smell of stale blood was becoming increasingly unpleasant. He had to get the stink and feel of it off his skin. Glancing at the blue water of the ocean he saw the solution and started to peel off the armor, his muscles and joints screaming at him in pain. He hadn't recovered as much as he had hoped. He must have been injured at the end of the fight worse than he had thought. Gohan dropped what was left of his armor at his feet. His boots were barely holding together either, so he kicked them both off, going barefoot. He'd already lost or destroyed his gloves during the last top part of his underlayer was also torn to shreds and beyond saving, and he started to remove it. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing?" The dark-haired girl yelled at him as he did so, now daring to speak up. Gohan glanced at her, but not knowing what kind of answer she was expecting ignored her question as he continued. Once he'd removed the upper body part of his bodysuit he heard hisses from the other three as they winced at the extent of the visible injuries to his body. "Well, keep your pants on at least," the girl ordered after a moment, her voice commanding even through the nervousness in it. He could at least do that. Gohan dropped what remained of his top with his outer armor and boots, and looked down at his chest, arms, and what he could see of his back and sides. Angry purple and black bruises ran from his left hip, past his rib cage, and into his armpit, and most of the left part of his back and shoulder. He ran his hand over his right arm where he could see and feel a rough scar running from the front of his right shoulder, past the crook of his elbow and midway down his forearm. Most of the cuts and burns he'd suffered had healed through a combination of the accelerated recovery owed to his Saiyan race, and the emergency care systems of his ship, but bruises tended to take a bit longer and he'd have to let these heal naturally over the next few weeks. The ship's emergency care systems weren't anywhere close to a fully equipped healing tank, which if entered quickly enough would repair all fresh damage entirely, given enough time. The physical scars that had remained he would now have to live with, and they weren't the first. He looked down at his hands again though, feeling all of a sudden that something had felt off when he'd clenched his fists a few moments earlier, as well as when he was removing his clothes. Squeezing his fingers on both hands, the muscles and tendons felt fine, but something just looked off with his left hand. "Shit," he mumbled. The tip of the little finger of his left hand was missing from the last knuckle on. The sudden shortness and lack of fingernail looked more than odd, but what was left still moved fine by itself. Gohan could even feel a ghost of what had been removed as he waggled the stump, as if the last knuckle and tip were still there. It had been removed with a remarkably clean cut judging by the smoothness of it, and luckily it had scarred over already, although was still blackened and bruised. Frustrating, but not something he couldn't get used to. At least his dominant right hand seemed fine. Despite the partial loss of the digit, the Saiyan smiled a little though. It was starting to make sense when this happened during the last stages of the fight, just before he'd escaped. Assuming he was remembering the details through the rage and anger he'd felt, he was sure he'd taken something from that bastard as well. Much more than the tip of a finger. Gohan used his ki to float from the ground and flew in an arc to the water's edge, hearing gasps from the two girls as he'd taken off. Even though the other man had flown in, flying probably wasn't an everyday ability here, it wasn't in most places he'd traveled in the galaxy. Approaching the ocean's edge, he was confident it was nothing dangerous. He'd been on enough planets where the oceans and lakes were made up of ammonia or methane or whatever else, but had the experience to be sure that this was simply water. Washing himself in it couldn't do him any damage. His Saiyan physiology could handle any pollutants or microorganisms that might be local to this planet. Wading further into the water up to his hips, his hands trailed in the water. He touched a wet finger to his lips. As expected, this was a saltwater ocean. On the short flight over, thirst had him, but even he couldn't drink this. His mouth felt parched suddenly, but hydration would have to wait. Finally he let himself sink underneath the water and used his hands to scrub at his body and hair, hoping the salty water would be enough to cleanse his skin. His thoughts drifted back to the last battle. Technically their mission had been a success, the target was dead. But it had turned into a bloodbath, and the closest Gohan had come to death. Guilt hit him, wondering if he could have done anything else to save they'd had no chance once Frieza arrived. It was a miracle that even one of them had survived. What the hell had Frieza been doing there anyway? The intelligence they'd hadn't said anything about that possibility, which would have been as major a piece of information as it could get. That monster was supposed to be on the other side of the galaxy right now. If they'd known the Emperor himself would be there, they'd have been nowhere near. That was even more concerning than even that to Gohan was how he had not even noticed Frieza's key signature until it was too late. If Frieza had learned to mask his key, then they were in serious trouble. Standing back up, Gohan looked at the water around him, now dark with the grime which had washed off him. Running a hand through his hair, he could still feel gunk in there, grimacing at the realization there were chunks of bone and tissue in there. He moved to another spot, not willing to wait for it to dilute further or for the current of the water to take what had been left on his body of those enemies, or his own blood. He went under again a few times to get rid of as much as he could. Occasionally small fish would swarm around him and he'd enjoy a peaceful moment watching them, or the birds again on the beach and in the air as a keeping an eye on them through their key. He ignored the three on the beach. He didn't want to feel judgmental eyes on him right now. Once satisfied he was as clean as he was going to get, he turned to the trio, who were watching him intently, discussing something between them too quietly for him to hear. He pushed his feelings of anger, guilt, and inadequacy down as deep as they'd go. Down there with the rest of it. Right now he had another situation to deal with. Before he headed back to them, he looked up at the sky again for a few moments, and breathed in. Something about the feeling of the air in his lungs and on his skin, and color of the sky on this planet felt comforting and familiar. He closed his eyes and let the light of the sun warm he floated out of the water, dried himself a little with a small burst of ki, and flew back to the three on the beach.